Welcome to episode 38 of the Various and Sundry podcast. I am your host, Matt Harmon, joined live in studio from the beautiful campus of Grace College and Theological Seminary by my good friend, my colleague, and the man who is even willing to persevere through the pain to bring you podcast content, the one, the only, John Sloat.
The pain is real, Matt. The pain is real.
Yeah, fighting through. So you're not at 100% today physically.
Nope. Hurt my back on Friday lifting, so in vigorous exercise.
Nice.
Hurt the back a little bit, and we've been laid up for a few days. But came to work today, trying to be a trooper through the pain and survive.
Well, I know our audience greatly appreciates you persevering through the pain to provide them with this quality content. So,
well, I feel like it's my duty to the listener to persevere through that pain.
I mean, this is the 38th consecutive week that we have produced content.
We haven't missed a week yet.
Not yet.
Knock on some wood.
And we are not going to let some back injury
as
you're trying to get jacked.
No,
interfere with that.
Not going to let that bother us.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, we would love to connect with you. You can find us on Twitter at V&S You can email the show, variousandsundrypodcast@gmail.com. You can also find us on our Facebook page, Various and Sundry Podcast. And we would love for you to visit on the podcast app the section where you can leave a 5-star rating, and would absolutely be tickled to have you leave a glowing review.
Yeah, we'd love to see a 5-star rating. We'll even take criticism in the review.
Yeah.
That's fine, but help our algorithm. Give us a 5-star review.
Yeah. I mean the deep tech Google algorithm, or Apple, I guess in this case. Who knows how that works, but we would appreciate that if you can do us a solid there. So busy time in sports here, John. Where do you want to start?
Well, I think we should start with the NBA playoffs.
Okay.
I think that might be the thing that wraps up the quickest here.
Yeah. So since we last recorded a week ago, there was a pretty significant upset. Both of us had picked the Clippers.
I know, that was so sad.
To go on to play in the NBA Finals, and they ended up losing in the Western Conference semifinals to the Denver Nuggets.
And did you see Paul George, the man with two first names? He came out after the game and said, this wasn't a title or bust for our franchise, even though we've traded away first-round draft picks for the next 7 to 10 years. But not a must-win a title sort of situation for them, which was just absolutely ridiculous.
Yeah, absolutely. And the fact that they lost, they exit the playoffs blowing a 3-1 lead to the Denver Nuggets is a bit of additional salt in the wound there.
Yeah, some resilience by those Nuggets.
Yeah, second consecutive round where they were down 3-1 and came back to win the series. That's never happened in the NBA playoffs.
What do you do with that sort of information? How does that impact how you're feeling about this next series going forward against the Lakers for the Nuggets? Does it make you go, the Nuggets are going to persevere maybe a little bit more? They got some toughness to them.
Yeah, I mean, I would think by now that if they're in the same situation, if the Lakers go up 3-1, which they're currently up 2-0 right now as we record on Monday, I would think that it would not be difficult for the Lakers to realize, the previous two teams that had them down 3-1 lost. So we probably shouldn't take our foot off the gas. We should
stomp on them a little bit.
Right.
Yeah.
I mean, it is remarkable. They've shown incredible resiliency. And even in the game last night where they went down 2-0 against the Lakers, they ended up rallying. Jokic, their star center, ended up carrying them down the stretch and gave them the lead with about 20 seconds left in the game. And Anthony Davis just hit a 3 with no time left on the clock to win it for the Lakers. I mean, that was a very intense competitive game. Jokic scored their last 12 points for the Nuggets, and I think Anthony Davis scored the last 12 points for the Lakers down the stretch. So a fun battle to watch.
Yeah, yeah. Could you imagine yourself 15 years ago going, yeah, the center for the Lakers hit a 3 to win the game on a design play for himself?
Right.
10, 15 years ago, we wouldn't be uttering that sentence.
No, not at all. Not at all. So, and then the Eastern Conference Finals currently at 2-1, where the Heat lead the Celtics. So interesting to track that series.
Yeah, who saw the Heat coming? Kind of steamrolling the East out of nowhere.
Yeah,
playing really good basketball.
Yeah, it is interesting. I wonder how much of their. I mean, they've been playing great, but they really weren't on the radar when it comes to. Here's a team that has a great chance of getting out of the East. I mean, most people were thinking Bucks or Raptors, maybe Celtics.
Yeah.
I didn't see anybody picking the Heat to come out of the East.
No.
And to me, what I wonder is how much of that, what role does there's no home court advantage anymore. Mm-hmm. So, some of these teams, like Toronto has a great home court advantage, great environment for them. And so, how much were they hurt by that? In the West, you wonder how much does it help the Nuggets coming back 3-1, where you're not playing any of those games on the road in the hostile environment. You're just playing in a neutral site with no crowd, and how much that helps them. Still impressive. I'm not trying to downplay what they've done, but you wonder if that's a factor.
Yeah, and I'm loving it. I'm loving the Heat playing so well. Jimmy Butler's been fun to watch.
Yeah.
Eric Spoelstra, I think, has been doing a really good job, and he took a ton of heat. Pun intended.
Nicely done.
When LeBron showed up, right, they were saying fire Spoelstra, bring down Pat Riley, but he seems to be doing a great job with that team.
Well, and I think what this has done is it has validated his credentials as a great coach. Because I think a lot of people are like, well, yeah, he won titles, but he had LeBron and he had Bosh and he had D. Wade. Like, roll the ball out, let them play. They can probably come close to winning a title. What are you really doing, coach? But here he is with a team with one sort of not elite level superstar, but like next tier down probably in Jimmy Butler. Wouldn't you say? Like,
yeah.
He's not a top 5 or 10 player in the NBA.
No. Maybe after the season we can have another conversation.
I don't know. Yeah. But anyway, so props to him. Weekend number 2 of the NFL is back. And what do we learn, John?
Yeah, Jets are bad. Jets are real bad.
They're worse than we feared.
Yeah. Yeah, things are real bad. I think it was worse that the owner came out and had a press conference that he supports the head coach, calling him an offensive genius.
That's never a good sign.
Which it feels like a thou dost protest too much, sort of moment. Which feels like the writing might be on the wall for Adam Gase. I mean, he's not a very inspiring leader to the fans. I imagine it's the same to the players. And they haven't been able to find anybody for Sam Darnold to throw to. I mean, Twitter seems to be on this isn't Sam Darnold's fault. This isn't Joe Douglas's fault. Mm-hmm. This is Adam Gase's fault.
Right.
And I think I tend to agree. I'd love to see Sam Darnold with a real coach, but it also kind of feels like the Jets are in a similar situation to the Knicks, where no one really wants to play for that ownership group.
Yeah.
No coach wants to come in there and take the blame for a dysfunctional organization year after year.
Yeah. So lots of injuries this past weekend in the NFL. Big names, too. Guys like Saquon Barkley blew out his ACL. Will miss the rest of the year. Nick Bosa for the 49ers.
Garoppolo went down.
Yeah. So lots of big name injuries for this past weekend. But, we're week 2. Now the teams that are 0-2 are in that sort of panic mode of we can't go 0-3. You look historically at teams that go 0-3, and they almost never make the playoffs. Mm-hmm. So that'll be interesting to see how that develops. Quick update on baseball.
Baseball's coming down to the last regular season week here, and then the playoffs begin. I think in a bubble, maybe a couple of bubbles.
That's my understanding. Is there some
here in the next
bubble action? Yeah,
next couple of weeks. So playoff baseball, always fun.
Okay, and the Mets will most likely not be participating.
They'd have to win out, and things would have to fall the right way, and it's a disaster. Although the Mets got a new owner. But I think we mentioned that last week,
I think
and
so.
I'm still excited about it, although he's not the most ethical person on the planet. That seems to be an issue.
Okay.
But we can do that. That's another podcast episode.
Yeah. And the biggest news in the sports world, as far as I'm personally concerned, is the Big Ten is back.
But not to the end of the month, not to the end of next month.
They announced they are starting their football season the weekend of October 23rd and 24th.
So are they playing Friday and Saturday games?
Well, I've only seen Ohio State's schedule, and I believe all their games are on Saturdays.
Okay.
So I don't know. Maybe there's a Friday game in there somewhere, but not for Ohio State. But, yeah, obviously thrilled about that. The fact that this team that Ohio State has is a absolute legit national title contender. I'm not saying they're going to win it, but
Sure.
They are definitely. I think once it was announced the Big Ten was coming back, I think the odds in Vegas shifted to now making Ohio State the favorite. So, again, you can take that for what it's worth. That's only saying they're clearly a legit national title contender. That's what
There you go.
say. But I will say I'm a little concerned about the protocols that they're using. So, the big thing was the medical piece and all that kind of stuff. And so they're going to use this new form of testing that they can test daily. And I think it's like a saliva-based one. So it's not as intrusive as maybe some of the other forms of COVID testing.
I think it's out of the University of Illinois. I think they've developed that.
And what's interesting is, and what's concerning to me is, if you test positive, you're out 3 weeks.
3 weeks?
3 weeks before you can return to action.
That feels like the most strict rules I've ever heard of for COVID.
Yes.
Wow.
And what's not clear to me is what happens if a player, given the possibility of a false positive, like let's say a player tests positive on Tuesday. Mm-hmm. Do they retest him on Wednesday? And then what happens? Like, so or is that it? It's like, this is the law of the Medes and the Persians. You tested positive, 3 weeks done, versus maybe test the next day and realize, oh, it's a negative test today. I mean, the governor of Ohio, we all know this story if you're paying attention, like about a month ago, tested positive for COVID. Next day they tested him again, came back negative, didn't have it.
Yeah.
So that's one of the concerns I have is you get this sort of, this very strict 3 weeks. And in a 9-week season, basically, they're going to play
That's a third of the season.
That's a third of the season.
Who made up that rule? Has it come down which university advocated for 3 weeks?
I'm not sure. I'm not sure that it...
It's got to be Michigan. It's got to be Michigan.
Hoping that Justin Fields tests positive sometime in that 3-week window before they play.
Toward the end. Yeah.
Sometime early December. Sometime early December, they're hoping Justin Fields tests positive. Yeah. So in any case, it will be interesting. One funny note on that is the fact that so Nebraska was arguably the most vocal about we want to play along with Ohio State, but they had a group of players that sued the Big Ten, sued them to get and filed all these Freedom of Information Acts to get access to the decision-making process. And so it was going around on Twitter that so when they released the Big Ten schedule, Nebraska opens at Ohio State. And there was plenty of joking of, okay, you wanted to play? We'll send you on the road to the best team in the conference and see how you feel, which they don't care. They just want to play. I mean, but in any case, you can, Lord willing, expect some Ohio State football discussion coming late October on the Various and Sundry podcast.
Oh, boy.
So fasten your seatbelts, get your popcorn ready. But in the meantime, we are going to move on to our main topic for today. And in our last episode, we discussed the, what to look for in a church and talk through some of the different things that one should prioritize, we think, in determining where you end up going to church, where you end up committing yourself as a church member. Now, this week, we decided it would be good to look at the flip side of that and talk a little bit about when should you leave a church? What circumstances might happen that would lead you to be able to honestly and legitimately and wisely choose to leave a church. Now, we're not talking about obvious things like you're leaving the area for a job or something.
Sure.
Well, obviously you're going to leave your church for that. But we're talking about you're not moving anywhere, you're involved in a local church. What are some things that may happen or indications or signs that should lead you to strongly considering and perhaps actually pulling the trigger and leaving a local church? Mm-hmm. So where do you want to kick this discussion off? There's a lot of ways we can go.
Yeah. Maybe start it this way. Have you ever left a church for any particular reason other than leaving the area?
Yeah, I have.
Really? What's that? I don't think I know that story.
We left. So while I was in seminary, so in the Chicago area, we were attending a church that we initially enjoyed very much. And basically after, we'd been there 2 years, 2 or 3.
And involved in ministry.
Yeah,
and
yeah. We were involved in
church.
their life education / adult ed section of the church, and we weren't in a small group, but faithful attenders and members of the church. We had actually become official members, and there was in our perspective, a growing decline in the faithfulness of the preaching, and a growing, I would say, maybe a practical abandoning of the gospel in certain areas, and talking about how we did discipleship and the influence of some psychological models and that sort of thing. That was arguably the main factor in us leaving the church. And so that was our story in a very brief nutshell.
Okay.
And there was another factor there too, probably, in terms of we had good friends that were serving in another local church that fit more of our theological and ministry convictions. So that was part of the picture there as well. But I'm intentionally being vague so as not to identify the name of that church or anything like that.
Yeah.
What about you? Have you ever left a church for something other than a relocation or something like that?
Well, I think that might be one of the graces of having to relocate so many times.
Yeah.
Growing up, is my family never left a church for those reasons other than relocating.
Gotcha.
So yeah, the only times I've changed churches has been when we picked up and moved. But when I was a child, we were in towns for 3 to 5 years max. So it's hard to become disgruntled enough to
yeah. You're the closest thing to a military kid who never was in a military family that I've ever known. Yeah. Typically when I hear someone's like, we moved every 2 to 3, 4 years, you're like, you're a military kid. Your mom or dad was in the service, and so you got re-stationed all around, and that's not your story at all. But
yeah, my dad's an accountant that likes change, which is an odd combo, and so we moved around every 3 to 5 years.
Yeah.
Or he switched jobs every 3 to 5 years, and we would pick up and go.
Yeah. Okay.
So no, I haven't. But Doc, as you're thinking through it now, what strikes you as a plausible reason to leave a church?
Yeah, so I think that foundationally, the key point needs to be, kind of the starting point is faithfulness to the gospel. Mm-hmm. And faithfulness to the gospel in both the sort of doctrinal form in terms of, if the pastor gets up one Sunday and is like, I don't know that Jesus was really God. Mm-hmm. Okay, that's a pretty clear departure from the gospel. After maybe a quick conversation there, it's let's be looking somewhere else kind of thing. But sadly, in some ways, I suppose, rarely is it that clear.
Sure.
Right? It's oftentimes a lot more subtle than that when it comes to a departure from the gospel. And even I would suggest that that you can depart from the gospel not just in a doctrinal sense, but even from a sort of ministry practice sort of sense, where you might have a great statement of faith on the website, but in terms of how the church is actually functioning, you could have a very legalistic culture in a church where it's, well, yeah, we believe the gospel, but what's really important around here is not watching R-rated movies or participating in certain forms of entertainment and that kind of thing. That's really important around here that marks us off as different. Okay, maybe that's a time for you to be considering elsewhere.
Yeah. No, I think those are both good words. I think there's a construct that I really enjoy that I think I picked up from Tim Keller. I don't know that I absolutely did, and I don't know that he's the one that came up with it, but we have to be.
It's a fair guess.
It's a fair guess when it comes to any construct that I have. But he talks about the difference between being a consumer versus making a covenant. And I think at times, and I think this is something we have to be careful about in potentially leaving a church, right? That the church does not necessarily exist for us, right? For our enjoyment and benefit, and Dr. Keller says that we make covenants with churches, right? That's why at our church we have a membership covenant, right?
Yep.
Meaning I am in this for not for my own good, but for your good.
Right.
Whereas consumer, he talks about it like, if I find a grocery store that has better prices than the one I'm currently going to, I'm going to go to that other grocery store because it makes sense.
Yeah.
But that's not the way we approach church. We approach church as making a covenant with it. So we covenant to be together through those things. And so it means you're putting up with a lot more than you would at a grocery store.
Yeah, absolutely. I think that that's a really helpful kind of framework, especially as we kind of move into one of the more common reasons that people leave a church is when issues arise within the leadership of that church.
Sure.
And having that framework of we are in a covenant community, not a sort of consumer relationship, helps us understand even that as we might see some deeply concerning things in the church leadership, that they are violating the church covenant. In essence, they're the ones violating the covenant relationship of a church that warrants you to consider leaving that fellowship.
Mm-hmm.
But what are some ways that you've seen where or issues that come up within church leadership that you think are legitimate grounds for considering leaving?
I think, well, some of the ones you've already mentioned, right? Departure from preaching the gospel, or departure from living the gospel, in a sense, was the other point you made. I'd also say when it becomes clear that church leadership has become problematic and yet doesn't intend to move on or repent. So if there's some sort of abuse that's taking place, whether it be verbal abuse, whether it be the battering of the members, or whether it be financial issues. I remember being in a church and leaving that church because we moved all the time, and hearing that the pastor of this 150, 200 person church was taking a 6-figure salary.
Yeah.
Which is very problematic.
Yeah.
And then when this began to circulate around the church, members would come together and just be like, well, what is what are we paying him? And the answer from the elders was, he makes something similar to this profession. And they pointed to, I think it was middle school principal, which was a very oddly specific.
But you know what that is. That's okay. Here's his salary. Let's Google who makes about this amount of money.
Yeah.
It's like, oh, perfect. Middle school. Who can object to a middle school principal?
Sure. Yeah, but that sort of secrecy and those sorts of things.
Yeah.
I was talking to friends down at that church who were thinking about leaving, and kind of went, it might be worth considering at this point,
right,
in that scenario.
Yeah, and I think that it's, even if there's not the obvious, financial issue, or maybe the obvious sort of moral failing that's not addressed, I still think that abuse, understood widely enough, can also be expressed in ways such as the way that the leadership exercises power.
Mm-hmm.
And if you can certainly, I think, spiritually abuse people by trying to constrain people's consciences to debatable areas, surely on the force of a pastor's personality or preferences.
Sure.
That even just the way that a pastor can communicate can at times be very coercive, if not careful. And so if there's that sort of that abuse of spiritual authority in that sense, I think that's also worth considering at that point if it's time to depart. I think there are some obvious ones, I think, that we hinted at in terms of, if there's sin that's not being addressed, that's a pretty concerning thing. Even not necessarily just limited to the leadership, So let's say, for example, there's an obvious case of adultery that everybody knows about in the church, but nobody's doing anything about. There's no spiritual leadership confronting the person caught in sin or whatever, and it's just sort of what role do we have in interfering in their business? That is your role as the pastor and the church leadership to confront sin and to call it out and to move in the direction of church discipline if necessary, if the sin is continued and unrepented of, and that kind of thing. So, that would be if that were to happen in a church I was a member of, that would be deeply concerning and an immediate. I need to start thinking about if we're leaving or not.
Yes. On the same note, avoiding confrontations is a big issue, right? Not calling out sin. On the other side of that coin would be that they call out everything, and want to make a big deal out of everything, and I think that would be equally a red flag to be like, I don't know how I feel about this, and in all this, I think we would both advocate for wisdom, right?
Yeah.
That no two situations are exactly the same, and we really need to exercise wisdom, and we do that in community with other believers, and we prayerfully consider these things. As well as reaching out to mentors and friends that are removed from the situation who can speak into it from a third-party perspective. I think are always helpful things.
Right. And I do think that it's we should stress that that leaving in many respects should be an act of last resort, and that it should be the kind of the last step in the process. Mm-hmm. It should not be here's my quick reaction to this thing that I think happened. I'm out of here.
Sure.
That at a minimum, there needs to be I should try to understand the situation as best I can, including reaching out to the church leadership and saying, okay, here's my perception. Help me understand this. This is concerning to me. And trying to have that kind of conversation before you're just like, I'm out of here. I don't want to mess with this kind of stuff.
Sure. Yeah. Reconciliation has to be at the top of our list.
Yeah. Yeah, absolutely. So
particularly if you're in a small town like ours and are going to see those people around town.
Right. Yeah. And that does create a bit of a challenge anywhere really where there's multiple churches. But when you've got these situations where it's when there are multiple options, and if you're just like, I'll just jump ship to this next church where, it's seems like there's a little less, if your threshold is, I don't like drama, and you're just like, okay, well, this church has some drama, that's not a biblical category, by the way, but
what?
But that church over there seems to have less drama, so I'm just going over there. I don't want to, there are proper places for church discipline and the way to do it. And so you might, that can strike some people as, whoa, they're exercising church discipline? Like they're calling someone to repent and they haven't, and they're kicking them out of the church? How awful is that? Well, actually, that's a very biblical thing if it's done biblically.
Sure.
Like there are biblical ways to do that and biblical grounds for doing that you should actually, in some sense, celebrate. Not that you're excited that somebody is getting kicked out of the church, but it should be an encouragement to you that the church is taking seriously its role to exercise spiritual care, and it is a form of care, for someone who has wandered off into sin and refuses to turn away from it. That the church is like, we need you to know about this, and we need you to join in praying with us and calling them to come back, to come home to Christ.
And it does require churches to work together, right?
Yeah.
In this sort of consumer model where people are like, well, I'm going to go to this church for a time and then move on to this church. If there is discipline, they can hop to another church in town. And I think it requires those elders to work together on those things.
Right. And that is where I think churches need to do their due diligence, that if you have someone who is new to your church and they're like, I want to become a member here, that making sure that they left their previous church on good terms.
Sure.
That it wasn't, you left because you committed adultery and the church tried to confront you on that and pursue reconciliation and call you to repentance, and you didn't like that, so you left. No, you shouldn't be a member here. But some of this is verging into discussion of membership, which is a whole other topic, and it's very related. But in any case, let's kind of wrap up this segment by talking about, how do you leave a church? So let's say you've come to the settled conviction, we need to leave. I need to leave. Mm-hmm. That whatever the issues involved in the church, they rise to the level of, this is not a place for me to remain. What are some things that we need to make sure that we think about in terms of process to leave a church?
Yeah, I think make sure that you don't just disappear in the night. You go to the elders, you go to the leadership, and you have a conversation about why you're leaving, or about why you're thinking about leaving, and what would have to change in order for you to remain a part of that church.
Yeah.
I think that's a good first step, and could lead to just like, we didn't realize this was going on, and lead to reconciliation, or perhaps they have more information that you didn't have and are able to provide that for you. Yeah. Just
a side note back to the story I told earlier in the episode. When we left that church, we wrote a long letter to the elder team, just saying, here was our experience. Here's ultimately why we're leaving. And to their credit, one of the pastors followed up and contacted us and said, would you like to talk more about this? But it was interesting. What he said was, we're so appreciative that you did this, because almost nobody does this anymore. They just leave. They just disappear. And it's, hey, whatever happened to so-and-so? And like, they haven't attended here for 6 months, 9 months. And obviously the bigger the church, the more challenging it is to keep track of people coming in and out. But so I do think you have to, at some level, communicate your concerns to the leadership and have that conversation. I think a second piece is, where possible, look for where you need to pursue reconciliation. That may not always be possible, but certainly something we should prioritize. And then I think leave graciously. Some people go out and decide, I'm gonna leave a path, a trail of bodies everywhere I go on my way out of here. Or try to be grabbing people as I go and all sorts of stuff. Not a good idea. No. And I think, there are ways, and this gets into one of the other points here is, have an answer ready. There are ways to communicate why you're leaving that are still gracious and that are still honoring without being dishonest either. Going out in a blaze of just trashing the pastors, trashing the elders, just doesn't it doesn't reflect well on you. It's not godly. There are ways to communicate. I'm deeply concerned about the ways that power and authority are exercised in this church, and I've made those concerns known, and they didn't seem to want to talk about that. So my family and I are moving on. That's one thing. You can say that in a very different way that is, leaving, dropping nuclear bombs everywhere kind of thing. So
Sure. And then I think finally, once you leave.
yeah. And just to be clear, that doesn't mean you cut off contact with the people in that church. Like, in other words, just because you leave a church doesn't mean you're like, well, I can't talk to that person who goes to that church anymore. Well, no. You see them in Walmart, you see them in the grocery store. If they're your neighbor, yeah, chat them up, talk with them. Like, that doesn't mean that friendships that were built within that church have to end just because you have left that church and moved on to another one. So I think those are some pieces to consider.
Yeah. And I think it also means like probably not going back for the annual potluck or whatever's going on at that church. I think it means making a clean break.
Yeah, absolutely.
Any resources you would recommend, Doc?
Yeah, we'll put these in the show notes. But there's a couple of different resources. Kevin DeYoung has a nice article on how to leave a church, just covering some of the things that we talked about there. And then I think all these resources I've got tagged here are from Gospel Coalition articles or videos. That top one there on our list, John, is actually, I think Sam Alberry is part of that video.
Love Sam Alberry.
I know you're a big Sam Alberry fan. So, but yeah, we'll post those and just things to think about. And again, I think, John, your point earlier about this being oftentimes a category of wisdom issue, more so. I mean, honestly, of course, there can be some very obvious, like, oh, yeah, well, that's a no-brainer. There's no wisdom needed.
Sure.
There. That's a direct.
It's black and white.
Yeah. But oftentimes it's not going to be that simple.
Well, I think this is a broader point, but I think 80% of life is probably needing wisdom, and it isn't black and white.
Yeah.
Right?
It's certainly up there. So, well, you can check out those resources here. So, on to our athlete, John, do you think?
Yeah, I think so. Why don't I walk through them real quick, and you can explain the ones that I don't know who they are. Our first athlete, I know this one, Curt Shilling, famous conservative pitcher.
Yeah, that's one way of describing it. Okay.
For the Diamondbacks, Red Sox, the bloody sock game is what he's known for. Whether it was faked or whether it was real, who knows? George Rogers, who was a running back for the Saints, apparently back in the day.
I think 70s, maybe into the 80s. That's about it in terms of what I know about him.
And do you want to break down a couple? And that's all we have.
Yeah, 38 is.
We're getting into some thin numbers here.
Yeah. I think we're in for that for the next couple here. We do have 2 Ohio State nominees. A guy named Champ Henson. How's that for a name?
I like Champ.
Yeah. He was a fullback in in 72 to 74. Yeah. So right around the time I was born. So I have no actual memories of him. And then more recently, Austin Spittler was a linebacker. Great name. Spittler's a good linebacker name. From 2005 to 2009. I'd say he was a good, not great college football player. Like, nothing that stood out to you a lot, but a very serviceable.
Is he a practice squad guy in the pros, you think, or
maybe? I'm not sure he even went
teamer?
On. Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah. So, well, I don't know how much of a debate there is on this one, John.
I don't think so. I think our conservative pundit pitcher will get the nod.
Yeah, he was always a big personality.
He's verbose, absolutely.
And so during his playing days, he was that way. And I think it was a bit of a shock to people that once his playing days were over, that he started off as a baseball sort of commentator and analyst and that sort of stuff. But then got into the political realm and became a very vocal conservative.
Got fired from ESPN over it.
Yes.
Yeah.
So with all of that said, I think he is our obvious pick for number 38.
Yeah, I think so.
Okay, Curt Shilling it is.
Based on his playing career, yes.
I mean, the bloody sock.
Bloody sock, yeah.
But even, I mean, he was an elite, an all-time great kind of pitcher in the postseason. He was dominant in the postseason.
And I think he had a season where he had more wins than walks, which is amazing.
Hard to wrap our brains around that. But so that's our athlete there. So on to one thing we liked. You want to go first? You want me to go first?
I can go first. Okay. I changed mine since the beginning of the episode, which happens more often than not. I've become a big fan recently, in the past few weeks, of The Dispatch, which is a newer news source that's come out. It is based on some fact-based conservative news, is what it's called, and they send out newsletters, regular newsletters.
How often are we talking here? Weekly?
So they have 4 or 5 staff writers who send out different newsletters on different days.
Okay.
Some of those are free days. Some of those you have to pay for. They do have 2 or 3 podcasts that are very popular. This is where David French works, Jonah Goldberg, some of those guys. And David French has a free newsletter every Sunday morning. But the podcasts are always free. And I've found their opinions and breakdowns helpful. David French, in his podcast, The Advisory Opinions, he used to be a Yale or a Cornell law professor. And so he's got an interesting conservative perspective on the law and helps break things down nicely for you. So The Dispatch, so basically anything from them at the moment.
Gotcha.
Seems
I'm glad you
really
clarified
great.
that, because our Columbus listeners, the main newspaper in the Columbus, Ohio area is the Columbus Dispatch.
Yeah.
And so when you say The Dispatch, they would naturally think their newspaper. So it's good to clarify. You're not talking about
I'm not
that.
talking about that, no.
Yeah. So my one thing I liked is this past week I received my author's copies of my latest book, Rebels and Exiles. So that's always a fun moment. The box arrives and you open it up and you finally actually see it in print and hold the finished product in your hands.
And they did a nice job. It looks nice.
It's a beautiful book.
Yeah.
It's well designed. And so...
and where can they pre-order that?
This little company called Amazon.com. Have you heard of this?
Amazon.com?
No, Amazon.
Amazon. Oh, like the rainforest.
Yeah. Small little company. They sell a few things here and there, and so you can pre-order it there. My guess is that even though it says it won't ship until October 27th of this year, I think since I got my author's copies,
You think they're ahead of schedule?
I think they're probably a little ahead of schedule.
Okay.
So, in any case, what a weird episode technically behind the scenes. I don't know if our listeners have picked up on this, but we had the Worship Arts studio going below us.
Yeah, I don't know if they heard the drums or not.
We had a little segment where we got our radio station interference.
Oh, we did?
Yeah, just a little bit. So, and then we also had just some weird things going on with the microphones, I think, little staticky at points. So.
Oh, really?
Yeah.
I don't have the headphones in, so I just don't know.
Yeah, so in any case, I'm ready to call mission accomplished if you are.
Sure. Yeah, we'll see if we have to re-record.
Lord help us, I hope not. But
We'll probably just go forward with it anyway.
yeah, I'm sure we will. We have pretty forbearing listeners, I think.
So they can handle it.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, mission accomplished. We've covered our various and sundry topics. We've talked sports. We've talked when to leave a church. We've talked about Curt Shilling and the bloody sock. We've talked about John Sloat's conservative news source. And we've talked about my latest book now, almost available for public consumption. So,
Yeah.
I think all that's left to say is the Lord bless you all real good.
Later.